Hello, welcome again to another episode of the Let People Prosper Show. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn, and I'm delighted today to have a guest here on the show, Dr. Casey Mulligan. He's been doing a lot of great research for a number of years, also at the White House, and I'll give his bio in a minute, but I'm really delighted that he is joining the show today. Definitely one of my favorite economists, definitely one of my favorite living economists as well, so all of that is in there. But I'm really looking forward to our discussion. We've got a good outline to go over what's going on in the economy, inflation, his book, Redistribution Recession, his book, You're Hired, and a number of other things that we're going to discuss today. But let me go ahead and give you his bio here. And this is from his website, You'reHiredTrump.com, from his book. So if you want to check that out, and I'll put that in the show notes as well. Let me go ahead and start with this. So Casey B. Mulligan, professor of economics at the University of Chicago, received his PhD in economics from the University of Chicago in 1993. He has also served as chief economist of the White House Council of Economic Advisors and as a visiting professor teaching public economics at Harvard University, Clemson University, and the Irving B. Harris Graduate School of Public Policy Studies at the University of Chicago. He is affiliated with the National Bureau of Economic Research, the George J. Stigler Center for the Study of the Economy and the State, and the Population Research Center. Casey has received awards and fellowships from the Manhattan Institute, the National Science Foundation, Wolfram Research, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Smith Richardson Foundation, and the John M. Olin Foundation. His research covers capital and labor taxation, the gender wage gap, health economics, Social Security, voting, and the economics of aging. Mulligan has written widely on the discrepancies between economic analysis and conventional wisdom. Before You're Hired, the latest book, he wrote Chicago Price Theory, which is another great book, The Side Effects and Complications, The Redistribution Recession, and Parental Priorities and Economic Inequality, which I would highly recommend reading all of those, which I've had the opportunity to do so, and you'll learn a lot. So definitely check those out. He has also written numerous op-eds and blog entries for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, the Chicago Tribune, blogsupplyandDemand.com, and other blogs and periodicals. You can follow him on Parler or Twitter at Casey B. Mulligan. Casey, thank you for joining the show.
Hi, Vance.
Great to have you with us today, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. I've been looking forward to it, and one of the things I really like to start off with here is I'd like to know more of why you chose economics and enjoy doing economics so much. Simon Sinek has this book, Start With Why, which I think really is a good book that people should check out. But why do you do what you do, Casey?
It was a bit of an accident. I was going to be a math major. The math instructors at my college were not all that nice. And Marty Feldstein I had an econ class. Marty Feldstein, who was a much more famous person than any of my math professors, still had very much time to encourage me to continue in that field. And so I did. I liked it and I was good at it. I do wonder whether, if I were in college today, whether I'd do the same, because, the atmosphere on campus has changed a lot. Marty Feldstein worked for Ronald Reagan. Would he even be allowed on a campus now?
Right.
Robert Barrow also encouraged me. Interesting whether somebody like him would be also allowed on a campus. I was born when I was born, so this is how it worked out, and I really enjoyed that. I got Chicago training, some from Barrow, but when I moved to Chicago for graduate school, they got a lot of training, and it's unique training, valuable training. You mentioned the textbook, so we're trying to pass it on beyond people who come to Chicago. That's really guided a lot of my research. There's not so many people who know the Chicago approach, and so there's a lot of work that can be done, a lot of opportunities for research. For example, a book you mentioned, The Redistribution Recession. I mean, it was, by the time we got to the year 2008, there weren't so many people in our recession who would look at a piece of legislation and ask, what are the incentives in there? What are the marginal tax rates? That's not the approach they took. And they talked about how much was being spent or how much was being taxed, but not the microeconomic incentives, which is kind of the first thing we look at in the Chicago approach. So that's an example of what I did. So it was a bit of an accident, but also the God-given talents I had were a factor in there. It's more fun to do things that you're good at, typically, not always, but
yeah. Well, no, that sounds great, and definitely those God-given talents are definitely on display from your work and the research that you do, and writing for a general audience too, where people can understand it. That's not all economists, right? It's definitely a good trait that I'm glad that you have and are able to convey that to people in a way that they can understand. I think is phenomenal. And I wonder, what about the Chicago school, in your view, makes it different than the other schools of economics that are out there when you think about, Keynesian economics, classical economics, Austrian economics? I mean, there's a lot of good schools, or some are good. There's a lot of schools that are out there. What in your view makes Chicago different?
I'm not sure I'd draw sharp lines between all those different schools. It's more theoretical. We live in a complicated world and lots of data around, and you need some way to organize that data. And either you can have thought seriously about how you organize the data, or you can do it by the seat of the pants. And that's what theory is for, is the former, to think seriously how you're going to organize all this information that you have. We give an example on a lecture, nobody's ever dropped a bowling ball off my roof. How do I know it's going to fall? Well, we have the theory of gravity that says gravity works everywhere, even on my garage roof. And
right.
But that's a theory. I mean, nobody's got any data on my particular garage. I mean, there's been plenty of bowling balls dropped in this world, and we generalize those other bowling ball drops to say that's going to work pretty similar on my roof, and that's what we do. And in economic theory, it's supply and demand fundamentally. Although you need to practice supply and demand, it's not quite as easy as it sounds when you just say it that way. But Supply and demand is the framework we've seen work over and over again. And we understand how to generalize and say, we've seen something taxed by the Treasury. Well, it's if implicitly taxed by the Department of Health and Human Services, maybe you're going to get a similar result. That's that theoretical framework that allows you to connect things that seem very different to the layman or the politician. The Treasury policy versus an HHS policy, but we see them as common. One of the reasons that approach isn't practiced a lot of universities, actually explained by the Chicago approach, which is it's been technological change. We've had a lot of change during my career favoring empirical work and the gathering of data. And so statistics and econometrics have become popular. And I guess there's a limited resource for people to allocate their time and what they study. So they've taken some time away from the theoretical foundations.
That makes a lot of sense. And I know with the Chicago school, I often think about, Frank Knight and Stigler and Friedman, of course, who's also one of my favorite economists. And so it's good to see that tradition is continuing, because it's so important. I think too often we get away from the basics of supply and demand and price theory and what the fundamentals are for these markets, to where, if government comes in and somehow they can automatically get us to where we need to be without seeing how they're going to distort the market from the other, like you said, with HHSC or HHS and other types of distortions that can happen in the market. Speaking of which, I know you've done a lot of work in healthcare, but also in tax policy and in general. Your book, Redistribution Recession, when did that come out? Was that 2009?
I started writing it in 2009. It came out in 2012.
2012. Okay, yes, 2012. But it was a lot about, of course, the Great Recession, which you coined the Redistribution Recession, and talked a lot about the implicit marginal income taxes, progressive, that go on with that. It's not just the explicit taxes that we pay, but the implicit ones. Would you provide, some context for our audience about what was going on in the Redistribution Recession, the implicit taxes that were there, and how that affects the overall economy to get us to the point that we had this major, what could have been a pretty minor recession in some sense became a much more extensive and longer and deeper recession during the 2007 to 2009 Great Recession.
Yeah, I think intellectually what had happened, as I said, we had this statistical revolution, which has been progress, but a lot of in our profession had studied individual programs. Maybe they studied, what is the effect of including the equity of a person's car in calculating their eligibility for food stamps? Mm-hmm. And they study just that little policy. And they find, well, there's no statistically significant effect. And they do that for a collection of them, would do that for a dozen or 24 other policies. And each one had no statistically significant effect. But they didn't step back and said, but wait, those are all kind of doing the same thing. They're punishing high income, they're punishing high employment, and it's kind of, in logic, they call it the fallacy of the heap. You know, you have one grain of sand and it might well, that's not going to make a heap of sand. I could add another grain. It's still not going to be a heap, but you have enough of them and it's going to add up to something that you're going to start to notice. And that's what Obama's so-called stimulus bill did. It was full of literally a dozen ways to discourage work and to encourage poverty.
And that was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act.
Yes.
Right. Yep.
Yes. In 2009, I think passed in the end of March, early April. Mm-hmm. And when you added those together, then you had something that was economically significant in terms of discouraging work. Now, there's another question. Well, when you discourage work, do people react to that? I mean, that's not something I addressed in that book, but I said we have a long tradition in economics expecting, and we have a lot of empirical work before me saying, you know, people do react to that to a degree. So if you give a strong enough push toward not working, you're going to have a lot of people not working. A lot of people on what scale? I mean, maybe you have 2 or 3% of the adult population not working as a result of that. Now you could look at the other side of the coin and say, well, 97 or 98% are still working despite the push. Yeah. In that sense, it's not a very big effect. But reducing employment by 3% per adult, that's a lot. That's like twice as big as a normal recession. Yeah. So, and I just kind of worked all that out, went through, first of all, measuring the policies, adding them together, going through the logic of supply and demand. If you're going to have policies of this size, which I quantified, what kind of a reaction would you expect? What size of reaction? And let's compare it to what actually happened. That's really the approach in the book.
Yeah, and I think it was something that always was in the back of my mind that this was going on, but it was great to see that you kind of quantified it and showed the effect of what those policies were doing. Because I mean, and there were a lot too, right? I mean, it wasn't just the ARA, American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, but it was also, you know, Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. There were a lot of things that were going on at that time, and that was also the time where I think we had the first round of enhanced unemployment benefits, if I remember correctly, where they were expanding that. And so that incentivized people not to work. And you were able to quantify that. Of course, they doubled down on that during the most recent recession, during the shutdown recession or whatever we're going to end up calling this later on. But you can see what those effects are. And it was great to see that you were able to put some of that, you know, quantify what those results are. I wonder, from your studies, would that mean that the recession wouldn't have been as deep in the Great Recession and maybe not as long had those sort of policies not been in place? Is that kind of the result of what you found?
There's no question about. There's a range, but about half of the depth of the recession I would attribute to these extra policies. Now, normally in a recession, you do have some of these extra policies. Yeah. You don't have. Obama had a $25 a week bonus, which was large at the time. It's now so quaint because, right, we had $600 a week.
Right.
But it was $25 a week bonus. That was brand new. Bunch of other food stamp expansions. We weren't doing that in recessions. In recessions, typically what we did was say, oh, you can collect your unemployment for more weeks. That was about it. So you would have had some of that anyway. But still, I go through the exercise, well, what if you just kept the safety net we had in 2007, which was a significant safety net? There were lots of programs there. Just keep those programs, allow people into the programs under the old rules, give them the benefits under the old rules. Well, the recession went about half as deep. Now, people sometimes forget, well, they think, well, maybe the ARRA came in March or April 2009. That was really after the recession. There was some of this stuff that came in the summer of 2008. Before Lehman failed. I show this in one of the first 3 pages of the book. You see the new programs popping in exactly at the time that the employment's taking a dive. So one could argue that the recession might have started later if it weren't for the programs, or it's hard to know. I mean, the timing part is always a tougher part of the research. But I think the easy conclusion is that the recession was a lot deeper because of it and lasted longer, because you kind of had a catch-22. Well, we can't end the programs until we end the recession, but half of this recession is because of the program. So it got drawn out for a pretty long time.
And it's tough too. I mean, it'd be nice if we could learn from those mistakes or issues that happened at that time. But sometimes history may not repeat itself, but it oftentimes rhymes. And that's some of what we see. We'll get to here in a minute of the most recent recession, and maybe even part of the recession that we're in now. But learning from those issues of what happened in the 07 to 09 Great Recession or the Redistribution Recession, I think it's so important. Some of the work that I'm doing now, the Texas Public Policy Foundation, is what's called our Alliance for Opportunity, and it's a poverty relief initiative that's a multi-state effort. And one of the big issues there is that if we're going to have these safety nets, which I would love for there to be the day where we have a robust economy, a flourishing civil society, where we don't need the safety net system that we have today, but that's not reality, right? That's not where we're at today. And so what we've been focusing a lot on is using kind of your insights on the cost of some of these safety nets, that there are incentives, there are disincentives to work. And the best path out of poverty is really a job ultimately. And so how do we reconnect people with work? And so one of our initiatives is to find ways to, with these safety net programs, is that the money needs to go to the people that the programs intend, instead of, other programs, waste, fraud, and abuse, and other things that happen. So it's not just the discouragement that happens from people working, but it's also the wasted resources that go into a lot of other areas that could be in the productive private sector, which brings up, opportunity costs and everything else. I wonder, with your research that you've done, do you have any insights on improving the safety net system so that it better helps the people that it's intended?
That's the way I approached it in that book is really to say, U.S. had a safety net, pretty generous safety net on a historical scale already in 2007. But a lot of Europe had an even more generous safety net. And who am I to say they're right, we're wrong, or vice versa? Yeah. But I'm just making a positive point, and that's kind of a Milton Friedman approach, that if we're going to be more European in our policies, we're going to be more European on our results. That's going to be with lower wages and lower GDP and then lower employment. I couldn't really say, which is better. One thing I think economic theory does say, you should never tax over 100%. You should never put a guy in a situation where he takes a job that brings in $40,000 and he has to give up $50,000 worth of benefits to do that. I mean, that never makes sense. And you had some instances of that around that Obama stimulus. But they were instances. They were affecting a couple million people in our 300 plus million country. Where we didn't learn, and I can call that a mistake, is when we went into this pandemic recession. Then we put many more people in a situation where they got more from not working than working. It's not just giving them a push toward not working. It's like, if you work, you will have to be worse off than if you choose not to work. And that is I don't know what else to call it. It's a perverse situation. That is a mistake. And shouldn't have been done. Europeans don't do that. Swedes did it for a short period of time. They quickly learned their lesson and peeled back. Really, only your pure socialist countries have done something so egregious. Great point there. And I think that's a good transition to a little bit more recent time. Is that you had the opportunity to serve in the Trump White House for a while in the Council of Economic Advisors as the chief economist, correct? Yeah, that's right. Unfortunately, we talked about this a little bit beforehand, but our times were very close together. I joined in June 2019. You left at the end of that month. We didn't actually get to see each other in person. I think we exchanged emails and things of that nature as we were working on some different things. But
You do have this book, You're Hired, which I would highly recommend that people check out and read. It's a really good read on a number of levels. But what would be what's your pitch on the book? What do you hope to get across to the audience?
Well, when I was there, saw immediately. I would see something with my own two eyes in the West Wing or elsewhere around the White House, and then I would read the opposite or 160 degrees different in the New York Times or the Washington Post or see it on TV. And I was like, wow, I mean, how can people get to know what's really happening? And I decided, well, maybe it's my job to deliver that. I'd written books before, not books nearly as fun as this book. Yeah, I did know how to approach the publishing and everything like that. And within the first month, I starting to realize, I need to be paying attention here, because if I don't remember what's going on and relay it to people, it will never be known. I mean, we will literally just, all we'll have is the fake news. And people are smart enough to know it's fake, but that doesn't make you know the truth.
Yeah.
And I wanted to provide the truth. And whether it was flattering to Trump or unflattering, it's not, I'm an academic. I just report what happened. And that's what I did. Now, Trump's a very interesting person. He's still in the news today. 3 years after I've left. So it's actually a great resource to understand how he operates. I mean, some of the things that we're speaking now, just a couple of days after the FBI went to his personal home in Florida, how's he approaching that? I can tell you, it's in the book. I mean, he's very good at managing social networks, is what I called it. I mean, he understands the follow-on reactions that will happen after some activity, and the follow-on reactions to the follow-on reactions.
Yeah,
and he's good at. He'll make us act. He'll take a ding himself to make his opponents do his bidding. And I had specific examples of that in the book where I was part of the conversation. I was mostly listening, and he was going through. Well, what can I do to get CNN to say what I need him to say? And this is definitely something he thought through carefully, and he successfully executed. And that's probably what's going on.
Yep. I think that's right. And, one of the things that I really took away from my time there was going back to his book, The Art of the Deal. He loved to push the envelope, whether it be with media, whether it be with some of the negotiated deals that were going on. And I've learned this in my own personal life and policy life as well, and academic life. It's important to try to get exactly what you want. Try to go as far as possible. What some call that, right, is the Overton window. Try to shift the Overton window as much as possible. And then, yes, you may not get exactly what you want, but at least you push them in that direction. What might be one of the big policies that you remember from your time at the White House that you saw that happen?
Well, I don't know about as relates to kind of his managing the social networks, but on the policy side, I mean, the deregulation was far and away the most amazing thing. I mean, the tax change was also a big deal, had big effects, but that got a lot of coverage. People were aware of it. It was kind of all one package, whereas the deregulation was literally hundreds of different things, all from a common philosophy, really a supply and demand philosophy. But it was a big portfolio. Your predecessor, Brooke Rollins, had helped manage a lot of that. She was very impressive. One of the few people who really understood the vast scope of the deregulation. Most of it was not environmental. I always got frustrated when Mick or Jared Kushner would go on TV and their example of deregulation would be something with energy or environment. Like, yeah, we did those, but there's many more times that we're doing that has nothing to do with it, with environment. Obamacare deregulation. I mean, all the insurance regulations Obamacare put in, we tried to take those out. I mean, that's got nothing to do with the environment. All the restrictions on consumer lending, it's got nothing to do with the environment. The payday lending, successful financial products that consumers were using, they were very upset. I mean, a lot of them, hundreds of thousands of them wrote in and said, why are you taking away the payday loans? This is how, sometimes that's how I pay for my kids' school, or I pay for the groceries or whatever. How dare you outlaw those things? And there are many, many examples like that. And working in the White House gave me the opportunity to see examples and then to analyze it systematically. That's what I did. And my last day in June, we finally finished a report that covered really the whole portfolio of deregulation, and tried to look at its effects, which of course were to raise GDP, raise employment, raise productivity, especially for lower income people. I mean, the onerous regs were really nailing low income people. You know, saying that you can only sell fancy electric cars. I mean, that's something that hardly scathes the rich people, right? But it really hurts the lower income people who, you know, they want to save their money for a pickup truck, and now you're not going to even allow the pickup truck.
That's great. We've just got a few more minutes in here, so I want to make sure that we cover some of what's going on in the current economy and what happened during maybe the pandemic or the shutdown recession and everything else. I mean, one of the things that I remember during my time at the White House was, you know, being in the Situation Room whenever COVID hit and having these discussions with Kudlow and Fauci and Birx and others, and the discussion about shutdowns and the effect it was going to have on the economy and all of that. But there was also the subsequent effects of the CARES Act, the ARPA, the American Recovery Plan Act, American Rescue Plan Act. There we go. And by the Biden administration, and the additional effects of what you saw during the redistribution recession, almost on steroids, though, from the extent of the amount of money that was out there. And you've done a lot of research in this space of the last, couple of years plus of, some people were getting about, $100,000 in payments from different programs. You added them all up together whenever their earnings really was much lower than that. And so we had an increase in savings and different things that have happened that I think have changed the psyche of a lot of the workers that maybe have had longer term effects than just those short term effects, given what's happened over the last year plus. So what is your thoughts on what happened during the recession, the recovery, and kind of where we're at now?
It was very disruptive. Both the huge cash payments and the shutdowns themselves, they were very disruptive. I mean, you think of somebody. Remember, we already had an ongoing drug problem in the country. Many people addicted. Lots of deaths among non-elderly people. I mean, these weren't people who were getting to the age of death. The young middle-aged people dying from drugs. This is already a problem. You think you're a middle-aged parent and your 20-something son is addicted to heroin. How disruptive is it to say to that son, I don't want you to work, and here's lots of money you're not used to having. That's what the CARES Act did.
Yep.
The deaths from drugs, which were already high, spiked immediately. This is a very disruptive thing. I mean, people in Washington never considered that. Maybe they don't know people who are addicted to heroin or fentanyl, but this was a very disruptive and deadly thing that was done. I pointed this out more in academic circles. I was back in academia then. People got very angry with me for saying that would happen. Mm-hmm. This is before we had the data that it did happen. But disruptive is the word that I use. And subsequently, I've learned, it's not just the drugs that were disruptive. I mean, alcoholism and deaths from alcohol. Yeah. You had people who had liver problems already, and you were, again, put in this situation. Here's more money than you're ever used to having. And by the way, we want you to stay home. Where the cheapest place to drink is at home. It's like a third the price of drinking at a restaurant or a bar. And these people with liver problems went back to drinking, and many of them turned up dead. Nobody was paying attention to that. In fact, it was considered politically incorrect to even suggest. And people had trouble managing we always have health issues. We don't live forever. That's the human being, right? But we always have health issues, and people were already, before the pandemic, managing their diabetes, their heart condition, their obesity. We could criticize and say, well, you could have managed it better in the past because we had obesity, right? But
Yeah.
You got to stop and think, wait, yeah, but they're still trying. And then the pandemic comes along and we do all these policies. We make it even harder to be successful in those areas. And so we had a lot of people dying from obesity, abnormal numbers of people. Even I think as we speak, we have abnormal numbers of people dying from these other conditions. So this is a very disruptive. From a human capital perspective, we made it expensive to acquire human capital of all kinds, including those that keep us alive. This has not been acknowledged. I've written this up and sent it to journals, woke journals, health journals are woke. They reject it out of hand. They won't publish it. They don't say my numbers are wrong.
Right.
They don't say they don't like the framing because they don't want to be told that their recommendations were deadly. The things they were cheering for were so disruptive that people died. And many people didn't die. They just have serious health problems now.
Yep.
And that was very disruptive. We're more aware of what happened in the schools. That's younger people. I mean, kids didn't die from not being in school, but they were sincerely, their human capital was really sacrificed. And this is an ongoing problem, and from disrupting their lives and disrupting their families' lives. And there's a huge policy mistake. That I'll call a mistake.
Yeah.
Are we going to learn from it? The people in government and in academics, it's not in their interest to learn from it because they're going to have to admit mistakes. So no, they're not going to learn from it. I mean, maybe as a generation goes by, there'll be a future generation that can look at it a little more objectively. The public health community's advice around pandemics before this pandemic was the number one thing: don't be disruptive.
Yeah.
Well, then the first thing that Birx and Fauci step out and do is disrupt like crazy.
That's right. Yeah. Well, and your former colleague and CEA director, Tomas Philipson, I mean, he had done a lot of research on this, and y'all had just written a report about pandemics and what to do and what not to do, and then they ended up following the things not to do. And it's so important. I mean, to your point, Casey, about looking at the trade-offs and making sure that we have been able to explain what those trade-offs were going to be. I mean, it's essential for economics. I mean, that's ultimately what is in our toolkit that's not in a lot of the other toolkits. And unfortunately, I mean, look, Fauci and Birx, I think, were somewhat doing what they thought was in their best interest for the nation from a health perspective. But the problem was is they weren't looking at the trade-off of what those costly effects were going to be on shutting down the economy. And one of the things that I've written about a lot too is the importance of the entrepreneur. I mean, we basically sidelined the entrepreneur by shutting down businesses so that we weren't going to get the same sort of benefits to people to overcome the virus and everything else as fast as we otherwise would. I mean, I think Operation Warp Speed has a lot of good benefits to it, but just think if we had been doing that along with the private sector also able to continue, I think we would have had many more solutions much earlier on than what we had.
I agree with you 100%. I mean, I had written a paper in March 2020. Couldn't get it out till like April 6th because I had my kids at home and dealing with that.
Yeah, right.
I said exactly that.
That's a whole other problem.
I said exactly that this is a new thing for most of us. That's when innovation is most needed. New ideas. And we're telling all these people that they can't go to the workplace. They're going to have to sit in their armchair and try to innovate how the workplace can be run differently and better so that we can both have our jobs and be safer. I said that early on. What I've learned since, and I've had a lot of data around this, is that the workplaces were actually safer than being home. Both because the demand is higher. You're in a group, and anytime you're in a group, providing public good is much more a higher priority than when you're out separately. This is Paul Samuelson proved that.
Yep.
So the demand for prevention was higher in the workplace, and then the supply is higher because a lot of these prevention measures, like changing the airflow or something like that, having a testing like the University of Illinois, which is a massive workplace, they created their own testing system. So the supply is greater. So you end up having much more prevention in workplaces than you did at home. And the results show. Even though Fauci's view is, Fauci kind of holds prevention constant and says, well, you're more safe at home because there's fewer people nearby. Yeah, holding prevention constant. Right. But economics says that why would prevention be held constant? You got to look at the supply and demand for prevention.
Yeah.
There's a bigger supply and a bigger demand in the workplace. And that overwhelmed the effect that Fauci was concerned about. You talk about people learning things. Phillipson and Birx was fighting against Birx and Fauci back in the AIDS days about some of these same issues. They won. And it's not empirically. They won in the marketplace for ideas. I mean, a university study of disease spread mostly took their approach, even though they were grossly wrong.
Yeah.
Their predictions about the spread of AIDS were way off. Thomas Phillipson's using economics were much more accurate, but they won. So we had to begin this pandemic with really an economics-free approach. Aside from that report that we had written ahead of time,
right?
It was an economics-free approach, and that a lot of people suffered by not understanding that these are human beings we're dealing with, and they don't just stand there and take it. They participate in groups and markets and try to make their lives better. Let people prosper. And that's this may be no better example of letting people prosper as in a situation like we went through in the last 3 years.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think we'll continue to feel and learn about the effects of what happened over the last couple of years. One being, of course, our kids and the effect that the school shutdowns. One silver lining, I think, from my perspective, is that we're actually going to see more parental empowerment, more school choice, because parents are more engaged, maybe more than ever, with what their schools are doing. And so that could be a silver lining that I think will help out not only for the families and meet the unique needs of each one of those kids wherever they need to go to schooling, but also the productivity of the nation and improving the education, the skills gap, and things of that nature could be helped along. As we move a little bit closer to where we're at now, we've got a situation, and this is on August 11th of 2022. We've had a couple of key reports that have come out recently. We had the 2 consecutive quarters of declining real economic output. First quarter, negative 1.6%. The initial estimate for Q2 is negative 0.9%. We have 2 consecutive quarters of falling off the map on productivity declines, over 7% and then over 4%. I mean, massive declines in productivity. And then inflation, of course, being the other big bucket over the last year for CPI inflation, 8.5%. I know the Biden administration talk a lot about the 0% growth in the month of July, which is true. That's what the numbers show. But year over year, we're still up 8.5% at a time when average hourly earnings are only growing about 5.5%. So we still have a huge gap of real wages, real purchasing power going down. Today, PPI, the producer price index, wholesale inflation up nearly 10% year over year. It's come down a little bit, so maybe this is a good sign. But there are just so many different factors that are out there, and the White House, the Biden administration, has tried to deflect and redefine things so much. I mean, look, Casey, you and I were in the White House. We understand that there is some marketing, if you will, of how you sell things. But I would argue that we were still realistic about the situation at that time. And what we're seeing now is just a clear deflection of reality of what Americans are feeling. And so I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on where you see the economy at right now. I've been calling this that we're in a recession. Not all economists agree on that, but I'm using just declining real economic output for 2 consecutive quarters. It's been called a recession since 1950 every time. So I don't see why this time is different. However, the labor market still looks, quote unquote, so strong. So where do you see that we're at right now in the economy?
Well, I mean, one of the things we do in price theory is we say supply and demand is one way to carve it up. The other way is price and quantity. Mm-hmm. And the labor market, the quantity of labor doesn't look so bad. I mean, there are different measures out there.
Sure.
A household survey suggests that the quantity of labor hasn't really changed in 4 or 5 months, mm-hmm. which is unusual. Normally, quantity of labor increases over time. But then the establishment survey suggests the quantity of labor has been increasing. So that's the quantity. But what about the price of labor, the wage rate? I mean, that, as you said, real wages are way down. So to say, the White House to say that the labor market's working well, I mean, if the point of the labor market is for people to work a lot and earn less. That is working well, but that's not the point of the labor market for really anybody. And not for the employers. They want their operations to be productive. Not for the employees. They want to have a nice paycheck, not a small one. So labor market's not working well. Now, there have been recessions where it didn't work well in different ways, more on the quantity than on the price. But certainly here on the wage rates, we got an issue. This is something that I predicted in 2020. I mean, Biden I'll give him credit. He said what he was going to do.
Yeah.
And so I went through that and I said, okay, if we do these things, what are the consequences? Follow really the pattern of my 2012 book, although I had learned a lot about regulation since then. So that's an element that I added in there. We added in there. Hassett and Fitzgerald and Cody Callan and I did this. And we said, here's a bunch of things that Biden's doing that's going to hurt productivity and real wages. And we quantified that. And here's a bunch of things Biden is doing that's going to reduce employment. Now, fast forward, Biden hasn't gotten to do everything he wanted to do. He was mainly only able to do the things that hurt productivity. Yeah. So big surprise. We have a contraction or whatever you want to call it that's mostly around productivity and not on the quantity of labor. That's right in line with what basic economics, both in the magnitudes and the directions, would predict would happen if Biden did the subset of his policies that he was actually able to do, and which were mainly around environmental policies and lots of regulation through the Department of Labor and through Department of Justice and various federal agencies are ramping up their regulatory activity. Department of Transportation.
Yep. No, I think that's exactly right, and I think it's something that would again the trade-off of the Trump administration, which you write, in your book, You're Hired, about the costs of some of the protectionism on the international trade front, and even in our economic analysis that we would do at the White House, I mean, we would show how that would slow growth. If you look at some of the economic assumptions that go in the president's budget, which you and I were on Troika, right? Yes. And what the effects with that would be, we were estimating that, look, this is going to slow growth compared to otherwise. But, we were fortunate to have such deregulation that took place during the Trump administration that I think was extraordinary to provide the boost in growth along with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I mean, if you combine those two, was just a huge economic juggernaut that unleashed the opportunity for entrepreneurs, for families to prosper. I mean, that was really a big part of removing those barriers that the president was really on board with the entire time. I think from my perspective, I think we could have maybe done a better job on the spending front, which is ultimately controlled by Congress, though. I think our budget, the last budget, we had $4.6 trillion in savings. So there was a good direction that we were heading. But some of these trade policy could have been different. But what's interesting, what I wanted to mention was that, the Biden administration has kept a lot of those same trade prescriptions in place. There hasn't been a large removal of any of the tariffs and other things. And I wonder, kind of from your perspective, price theory and everything else, what else should we be doing to deal with some of the issues like China? I mean, even though I'm not a huge fan of tariffs, I do, understand that there are issues with what's going on with China, and they don't play by the same rules like other countries. What would you say that says, okay, if we're not going to do tariffs, what else should we do, if we should do anything?
Well, one of the things when I wrote the book, wrote it in the end of 2019, came out in 2020. I talked about, okay, when we were in the White House, we talked about what's the alternative to tariffs? Free trade. And stop. That's what we did. And CEA, OMB, also Kudlow's group, people in Treasury. That's what we did. Okay. When I got out of the White House, I was able to take more time to think about it, look back at the history. And I said, of course, free trade is an alternative, theoretically. Okay. But what are some of the other alternatives to tariffs? Well, quotas. Quotas are an alternative.
Which I learned a lot about it from your book. I didn't realize that Reagan had put in so many quotas.
Yeah, Reagan did a lot of quotas. The Jones Act is a quota, 0, which Democrats and Republicans, Bush, Obama, Biden, you name him, they are very much on board with the Jones Act, and big deal in Texas because it means Texas has to send their product across the ocean instead of to another American. So the quota is a big deal. And so that's an alternative. I said, you better look out. You don't like the tariffs, you might get quotas. What did Biden do with the steel tariffs in Europe? He changed them from tariffs to quotas. The quotas are even worse than the tariff. The difference between the quota and the tariff is something in price theory we've studied for over 100 years, but I explained in the book. The difference between a tariff and a quota is who gets the money. The tariff money goes to the U.S. Treasury. The quota money goes to the foreign sellers. So Biden literally took money out of the U.S. Treasury and gave it to European steel manufacturers. That's worse. So, the free trade, I prefer to the other two. But you could say, you can make the argument, well, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And then you also have the intellectual property issues, which everybody acknowledges around China. I raised in the book, not new. We had these issues with East Asian countries before. It wasn't China back then. It was Japan, also Korea, some other East Asian countries. And Reagan used tariffs to threaten them. And it took Reagan until Reagan's second term until he got copyright and other protections put in place in those countries. Trump hasn't had his second term yet. So if Trump would have been on the same path as Reagan for dealing with those issues, it would have been in his second term that he would have pulled that off.
No, great points there. Well, we've got a couple more minutes left. And so you have another report out here recently. This is through the Committee to Unleash Prosperity, which does a lot of great work, and you publish through them quite a bit about the Inflation Reduction Act. They love to put these names in there that really don't do what they're trying to say they're going to do. But you noted that this would cost about 900,000 jobs lost over time, losses in economic output, and things of that nature. What would you say? Like, what's your key pitch on this bill in particular, and where you see the next couple of years going in the economy from your perspective?
Well, that report was pretty easy to write. The hard part, I had to read what's in the Inflation Reduction Act. So that was the hard part because it was like 800 pages. But once I did that, I could say, these are more elements of Biden's campaign promises, which Hassett and Fitzgerald and Callan and I had already analyzed. So there are a few differences which we accounted for, which I accounted for. But then I was able to say, turns out this bill has some of the productivity harms, but more the employment harms, discouraging work, especially through the Affordable Care Act, had some of the productivity harms in terms of taxing corporations. And so I put those together and say, what's the effect of the chunk of Biden's agenda that is called the so-called Inflation Reduction Act? And that's what we did. Estimate that it'll reduce income per family by about $1,300 per year, which is less than the full Biden agenda because the full Biden agenda is not in there. But that's significant for one piece of legislation that 50 senators don't want.
Yeah, that's right. And, I think that looking at it, the way that I've been kind of messaging it is that it's going to lead to higher taxes, more inflation. It may not necessarily raise inflation from what they're saying, although I think they're using a lot of rosy scenarios from some of these other reports that are out there. I do think it will lead to more inflation, but also a deeper recession. I mean, this is putting more fuel to the fire of what's going on. I mean, I follow kind of the Friedman idea that it's really the money growth that creates inflation. But in order for there to be more money by the Fed printing, it comes from increases in debt. And the IRA would increase debt in the first few years, even no matter which one of these measures you look at from the different reports that have come out, because a lot of the tax increases are later, whereas the government spending is early on. And so you would see increases in debt. And so I think it's going to be another devastating impact on the economy at a time when we're already feeling a lot of the brunt of the past bad policies that have been put in place.
I think another issue that will show up with inflation is the Fed. Of course, the Fed controls the quantity of money, controls at least the monetary base. They control the Fed funds rate. If they misread the weak economy going forward is something that they can alleviate, then they'll go to an easy money program.
Mm-hmm.
I'm confident actually that they will misread it. I mean,
Yep.
they have their staff has never been on board with the idea that you need to kind of look at these implicit taxes.
Yep.
You need to look at productivity effects of legislation, maybe because they want to be apolitical. I'm not sure what the reason is, but the result is they misread as the harm from these policies like Obamacare and the stimulus and now the IRA, as they roll out, they misread what's happening. And it's tempting to have easy money because when the economy is weak, they think, well, maybe if we're a little less aggressive and stopping inflation, maybe we can help this economy out a little. Where the real help would be just to stand up and say, look, these are the policies we're having. We're having European policies. We're going on a trajectory toward European results.
Yep. Well, that's exactly right, Casey. Thank you so much for being a Let People Prosper show. I think we've got so much to learn from this discussion and from your books that hopefully people will check out. I think all of them are great, so hopefully they will get one and learn more about this, so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. And unfortunately, we're doing a lot of those now that hopefully we can learn and provide more opportunities to let people prosper in the future. So thank you again for your time today, Casey. And I look forward to reading more of your work and maybe having you on the show again in the future.
Yeah, glad to talk with you, Vince.
All right. Thank you. Thank you again for joining us today.